All right, well, first of all, thank you, Sergio and Bradley, for having me here today. I am a recovering bureaucrat. So I say that because my presentation is more about training and requirements, or not necessarily legal requirements, but proposed industry requirements for a lot of what we've spoken about here today. One of the benefits of being at the tail end of the conference is I get to take all of everybody else's hard work and brainstorm it right here and now to make me look even better. So thank you all for everything you've done. But really what I'm talking about today is training crews for sailing cargo vessels, or as we've heard the term, sail freight. Now, I've worked with attorneys for many years, being a pure bureaucrat. So these opinions are mine, my own, and mine only. Don't blame anybody else if you don't like them. Okay. So currently we are seeing, as we've seen here today, and as I'll discuss here in a few minutes, a resurgence of sail freight cargo, both by traditional builds, wooden vessels, also other hybrid designs. We see tall ships as museum attractions, right? They bring us a sense of nostalgia, which is one of the reasons why we see them coming back. But also, as we've discussed quite a lot, is they are, in essence, mostly emissions free. They meet the new international requirements on greenhouse gas, which, needless to say, is a big deal. Naval schools worldwide use these. Unfortunately, they do not train their mariners, their Navy cadets, how to do this for a profit. Anybody who's been involved in military knows profit is not the name of their game. We've also seen these vessels being used to carry trainees. And that term trainee is very important because it's a differentiation between passenger, which is a type of cargo, and a trainee, even though they both pay to be there. So, there we go. Okay. So with the increasing IMO 2020 rules, as we've heard yesterday, today, this is becoming ever more important. And it's honestly my prediction that we will see more sailing cargo vessels here at an exponentially increasing rate in the next few years because they suit the need, they can do the job. And let's be honest, what is cooler than seeing a schooner pull into port and offloading rum? Honestly, I would hang out on the dock just for that, right? But they are a business. We have seen them already make a comeback here in the U.S., the schooner Apollonia. In my former job as a bureaucrat for the Republic of Vanuatu ship registry, we had several of these vessels registered working in European waters, between the Mediterranean and the northern ports of Europe, carrying all sorts of nostalgic cargos, coffee, tea, wine, rum, basically everything that I start my day with. They are, as Stephen so eloquently put earlier today, they're packet vessels. They are on a liner run. These are not tramp vessels, which means that they are on specific predetermined routes, which as the benefit of, as mariners sail these waters, they acquire a local knowledge, which becomes very critical, especially when coming in under sail. Now, these vessels are reliant upon two sources, mainly for their income: cargo and trainees. Now, the drive, as I understand it, and I'm sure the experts in the room will correct me if I'm wrong, the drive is to get away from trainees as a source of revenue. They are great to train people for the next evolution, but they are not the primary, will not be the primary income model moving forward. It's going to be cargo. Okay, but a trainee is not a passenger, meaning that they do not necessarily have the same protections under SOLAS that we see on a cruise ship leaving New York Harbor. And what does that lead us to? There's a lack right now of real international requirements. If you take a look at SOLAS, at STCW, the beginning of both of these conventions exempt wooden vessels of traditional build. Sailing vessels are exempt, even if they're not wooden. Vessels of traditional build are exempt, meaning it's up to the industry to provide the safety and regulatory standards for these vessels. Now, that also means that the mariners sailing on them And I'm not disparaging any of the mariners. These are fine, trained, qualified, dedicated people. But the standards for sailing these vessels and understanding the sailing aspect is not there on a standardized basis worldwide, which was the push for STCW back in the 1990s, after we saw a slew of mishaps with vessels and non-standardized training. Okay, and this is also true for vessels under 500 gross tons. So as Stephen pointed out eloquently yesterday, talking about U.S. requirements for license for 25 gross tons, 50 gross tons, 100 gross tons, those sizes do not exist in STCW. It's 500 gross tons and under, and that's it. So as we're talking, these vessels sailing not just locally, but also internationally, transatlantic, trans-Pacific, hopefully someday, we will have to have these vessels crewed with people that understand international requirements and have a standardized set of training, so that we can build this as an industry to go from one vessel to another. And sure, familiarization will be an issue, but at the very least, there will be a basic understanding. So why is this a big deal, right? Why do we care? It's always the question my doctoral advisor asks me, why do I give a damn? So right here is a picture of the HMS Bounty replica that sank during Hurricane Sandy, October 28, 2012. 2 people lost their lives that day. Thankfully, there were no more. This was due in part, as per the National Transportation Safety Board, to the lack of understanding of the master and of the forces at hand. Master made the best decision he thought was right at the time. It proved fatal. But the NTSB put it right there in their report that this was a leadership issue on board. Now, I learned something today, and I thank you, Stephen, for this. There were sailing vessels during the oil crisis. That I did not know. But a lot of my research was based off of initial source material from the book Tall Ships Down by Dan Parrott. Thank you, Sergio, for lending it to me. And really, the end of the heyday of sailing vessels was around World War II, very early post-World War II. One of the biggest losses was the sailing vessel Premier. And what happened there? There was a lot of things that went wrong, and we'll talk about that, but there was a loss of knowledge sharing. So from an academic standpoint, that is the passing on of knowledge from one group to another for training purposes, business practices, etc. It's now 2023, right? So around 70 years has passed since the last of these vessels were truly sailing on a regular basis to now. So we've had a loss of several generations of knowledge. Not to say it wasn't ensconced in manuals and books, but the actual physical hands-on knowledge that existed pretty well died out. And so as we're building these businesses, we are looking at the fact that we are looking at diagrams, at pictures, and learning somewhat as we go. As you know, we've heard mistakes happen, accidents happen. I am case in point of many accidents happening at sea. I'm still standing here to tell the tale, thankfully, but not everybody is always so lucky. And we want to minimize that loss of knowledge by having somewhat of a schematic for training. And I'm not proposing that we follow STCW. For those of you in the room, STCW, Standards of Training and Certification of Watchkeepers. Anybody who's gone to sea for a living recently has burdened themselves with hours upon hours of training that is highly questionable, but you have to do it if you want to keep going back to work, right? Stephen? Like, yeah, you know, you've sat through some of these classes. Always important, but some of them you sit through and you wonder, do I really need to be here for this? So I'm not proposing that we ensconce this in international regulation. As a recovering bureaucrat, I can tell you, you do not want that. That is not something anybody wants. But there are alternate methods. Industry organizations have popped up. Something like the Offshore Support Vessel Dynamic Positioning Association is a perfect example. OSVDPA. took several owner-operators of ships down in the Gulf of Mexico and created a training requirement for dynamic positioning operators that standardized it. So if an officer leaves Hornbeck and goes to Edison Schwest and has that certificate, well, they're still trained in the eyes of the company. And it doesn't have to be a regulatory requirement, okay? There are certain topics that we do need to consider, though, that are a baseline for safety. And one of them is stability, right? If you take a look at current training instability for deck officers, nowhere does it talk about angles of heel due to wind on sails or bare poles. If you put me on a sailing vessel right now, sure, I can pull on a rope. I can get out a sextant and navigate for you. I'll swill the rum in your hold. But what I will not do is be able to tell you if we are entering a danger zone as far as stability due to the winds. That is not something covered in current training. But if we are looking at transoceanic crossings, it is an important consideration, coupling that with weather routing to know what is the optimal route for us and safe, okay? Flooding and down flooding angles are also something of a consideration. We've seen that in several small vessel accidents of tugboats right here in New York and on the East Coast. Down flooding, for those of you, I'm sure everybody knows, is basically water pouring in through an open hole, sinking the vessel further, allowing more water in, and it's just a catastrophic domino effect, okay? Now, if we take a look again at STCW requires deck officers to have an understanding of the means of propulsion of a vessel. Sure, I can tell you how a jet boat works. Can I tell you actually, as a deck officer, how a square rigged sailing vessel actually works, or a schooner rig? Nope. I'll point at the pretty sails and say ooh and ah and distract you and dazzle you with bullshit, and hopefully you'll buy it. So absolutely find the wrong, right? But there is no internationally recognized sailing license. There are programs. Hull ship associations, wind ship associations, all have programs. But there's nothing internationally recognized or standardized that really allows one officer or crew member to go from your vessel to his vessel with a certificate saying, hey, I know enough of what I'm doing, give me a familiarization, and I'm safe on board. And that's the level that we need to eventually get to. And it's not something that we want to do on the job. There's always a level of on-the-job training. But I don't want my nav officer learning how to handle sails when we're underway. That generally is not a good idea, right? That's why we inflate the lifeboats in the pool before we actually have to learn to inflate them in an emergency, okay? One of the things that's big for me, maintenance and repair, right? If we're looking at fiberglass vessels, wooden hull vessels, those take on a whole different aspect of maintenance and repair than the cargo ship made of steel, where you spend hours upon hours with a needle gun and a grinder and rags and painting and fumes. That's not what these vessels are going to look like. But maintenance and repair is very critical, as is evidenced by the Marine Electric accidents, which was a loss of 31 of 33 of the crew members. Most notably because wastage of the steel and inefficiency in maintenance of the vessel. An accident like that early on in an industry like this would prove catastrophic to any future growth. It would be such bad press, it would be very difficult to get over, right? So we need to look at this as an aspect for the crew of what they need to know prior to embarking and getting underway. Now, cargo and stowage. Anybody who has ever seen a container ship fire knows that there's issues with separation, segregation, cargo stowability, right? Now, we're talking about a variety of different products that are carried on board. Let's use my favorite example, rum, okay? You take rum. Now, earmuffs, because you guys are underage, right? You take rum breaks, bottle breaks. aside from the crying that happens, one of the most popular pastimes on board a ship at sea, having a smoke. Rum breaks, mariner has a smoke. What happens? Rum catches fire, right? Well, you have to have a little cream with it, right? But the point is, do we understand what is happening with our cargoes? An expansion and contraction of lighter grains. If we're carrying those in sacks, what happens when they get wet? At what point do they expand enough that other cargo can be damaged? When do we ventilate our holds if we're carrying cargoes that are somewhat perishable? These are things that we teach right up here in marine transportation. But is it something that a 500-ton cargo ship officer necessarily learns? And I can tell you, as a matter of fact, the answer is usually no. I've taught enough of those classes. It's not something generally covered because those licenses generally do not work on these size vessels carrying cargo. Okay. Now, effects of stale on stability. Martina made a great point yesterday as I was driving my car home. When we look at vessels like this with sails, totally different concept, but once again, I'm used to this without the sails, right? I've never had sails on a ship unless I was sitting on a sunset cruise. The effects of heel on a vessel are very different when under sail versus when under power. The depth of the keel necessary to handle this is going to be different in relation to this vessel, right? Now, if I'm looking at a chart and I'm navigating, preparing a voyage plan as per IMO regulations, I have to have an understanding of the change my vessel may make when it rolls here to and fro, entering a harbor under sail, to make sure that I do not miss my under keel clearance mark and end up going aground, which would obviously be a very embarrassing situation, okay? As opposed to successfully docking, offloading my cargo into bikes and pulling it a merry day, okay? Now, I keep going back to stability for a reason. Another accident was the El Faro. Now, there were a lot of issues with the El Faro, and there's not enough time to even go into all of that, but one of them was a lack of understanding of the vessel's construction, modifications, and the stability. But none of the crew survived to tell the tale. Again, if we are having a training program and looking to the future of sail freight as a viable means of transoceanic crossing, we need to have a thorough training for those people on these vessels to know what it is that's going on. Otherwise, something like this is what we're looking at, which again, no one wants, okay? There is many decks on a cargo ship, much less on a sailing vessel. So a lot less room to flood, right? Something goes wrong with stability, you do not have enough time to necessarily consider the alternatives, or you have much less than if you were on a larger vessel, okay? Which leads me to emergency situations. I know what to do if my row catches fire, right? I don't know what to do if my vessel made of wood lights up like a piece of tinder. I wouldn't even know where to start. Most of our models for training and firefighting are not based upon this, especially, and as I said, recovering bureaucrat. Several of my former customers did not want me to say to them, you need to have a power-driven fire pump on board. They wanted to use fire buckets and hand pumps. Now, I get it. Space, weight, fuel, all go against the grain of what's trying to be accomplished. But if we're not planning for emergencies and understanding what the emergencies are, then when they arise, we're going to be caught up the proverbial river without a paddle, okay? What happens when a vessel dismasts unintentionally get sick? Do we have an emergency kit for that? Have we planned and trained for that? Now, once again, I'm an accidental sailor. I don't have as much experience, but I do know from enough Patrick O'Brien books that purposeful dismantling was sometimes a case. But when do you do that? And how do you recover from that? These are not things that are currently being trained upon, but should be considerations in the future. Cutting away of sails. Yes, I know you see it in the movies. It's not an everyday occurrence. But once again, we don't train for everyday occurrences. We're training for when it's the worst case scenario and hoping for the best. Okay. Now, once we finally have resolved how we're going to train the crew, having enough crew is also a really important consideration. Another argument I used to love to have with vessel owners who would say, I don't need a lookout during daylight hours, because STCW says if it's daylight and there's no traffic and clear visibility, I can have a single watch standard. To it, I would always reply, can you predict if there's a fog bank coming in, rain coming in, or if you're about to sail into a fishing fleet because you don't have a high enough radar? So we have to look at how we're crewing these vessels, not just for the safety purposes, but really for work and rest hours. Anybody who's gone to sea has stayed up many hours past when they should have gone to bed. Anybody who's done that will probably have a story, or one or two or several of, well, I'm lucky that I didn't kill somebody that day. I probably should have gone to bed 6 hours earlier. When you have a smaller crew size, these issues become exacerbated, meaning you don't have someone else to help you recover while you're exhausted because they're already exhausted. So owners, there will be a burden on owners to consider this, right? And to work with the regulators as this industry builds up to build in a level of safety, okay? One of the considerations also is having someone with engineering training on board. Yes, these are sail vessels, but what have we heard today? Solar power panels, hydrogen, batteries, living compartments, cranes. Well, unless we have a lot of gerbils in cages running circles chasing pellets, the power has got to come from somewhere. And when there's power, there also means something is going to what? Break. Okay. Who here has dropped their phone in the water? Don't be bashful. Most of us have dropped our phone in the water. And then what do? Stick it in a bag of rice. Now, where did you learn that? Did you look it up on the internet? What do I do if I broke my phone, dropped it in the water? Of course not, because your phone was broken because you dropped it in the water. You had somebody who could tell you, right? What happens when you're at sea and you have no one to reference because, well, the power is out? Okay, these are one of the things that for short sea shipping is not as big of a problem, although it is a consideration. But for larger crossings, this is going to be something of importance. Now, no one is saying that this engineer has to be sitting around doing nothing if everything's working fine. Put him to work. Absolutely no, put him to work. But you need to have a minimum of somebody on board that knows what to do when this equipment is not working. Okay. Now, we talked about that already. So, in the book Tall Ships Down by Daniel Parrott, there were a number of cases where vessels went down, most notably due to leadership and lack of knowledge. This was at the end of the heyday of sail, where people were holding on to that last grasp of breath, trying to keep the industry going. But a lot of the more experienced mariners had already left the industry. That was, like I said, 70 years ago. And there were a slew of accidents then. We are bringing it back, and it's a wonderful thing. But without looking and having a wonderful historian to point towards what happened in the past, we are, as the saying goes, doomed to repeat it. Now, not all of this is doom and gloom. There are methods. There are options out there. The industry, as I've had the chance to interview a lot of wonderful people, has their own internal vetting system. If I were to apply for a job right now, they would say, well, yeah, he's a nice guy, but he doesn't know shit about sailing, so don't let him do anything but cook, even though he has his master's license. They would be very right in doing so. I wrote a cookbook. I'm a damn good cook. But that only gets you so far, internal vetting, right? Cross-referencing with colleagues. There are training programs out there, two notable ones that I've come across. One of them is the Picton Castle up in Canada, a 6-week program where they teach the basics of deck seamanship. But it's the basics of deck seamanship on a sailing cargo vessel. It's kind of where it ends. The other one I will not try and pronounce for you, but it's in the Netherlands and it has a long, beautiful name that I would slaughter. They have programs talking about stability, navigation. It's a 2-year program with an internship. But again, small program, not well recognized or known. And these two programs are not standardized between each other. So an entrant into the industry, someone looking to make this their next career, does not necessarily have a place to turn without getting confused. And this is what, as an industry, we have to look towards, because once again, as a recovering bureaucrat, if the industry doesn't do it, the regulators will. And when the regulators get to it, it gets much more costly for everybody involved. Okay. So, to wrap things up, these vessels, the traditional build sailing vessels, newly designed sailing vessels, are a phenomenal option for the carriage of cargo. They have recognition, they have nostalgia, they also will fit into ports that larger cargo vessels won't. They are a scalability option. They also will draw people in that modern cargo vessels may or may not. There's comebacks in the US, there's comebacks in Europe, there's talk of comebacks in Micronesia and in the Pacific. They meet the environmental goals that we're looking towards sustainability. But we have to move forward with caution and an understanding that, once again, we are putting people in a hazardous environment. We can love it as much as we want, but accidents happen at sea. When we look at it from that perspective, we have to do our due diligence to allow people to enter this industry, do so safely and prosper. So, thank you. Sir. Yes. Yes. Owner operators gathering together to form a baseline training standard. Well, there are options out there. There's the International Windship Association is one. There's, tall ship associations around the world that could be the front face for it. But really, I see the owner operators as having the need to gather together, and as well as the few training schools that are out there. Because if the owner operators are, as we've seen, designing the vessels, operating the vessels already, they have a vested interest in making sure that there's people to crew those vessels already. But alone, they don't necessarily have the funds or the resources to do it. Partnership with each other and other institutions would accomplish that. Yes. So, and that comes into what on modern vessels we call the safety management system. When I board a new ship as an officer, I have to have a familiarization of that particular vessel. I know the basics about, well, what are the basics about navigation and maintenance. So I can step on with that knowledge and become familiar with that vessel. So what I'm looking at is a baseline familiarization of stability, maintenance, emergency situations, the basics of sail. And when you go on to new vessels, have a standard by which someone learns, pun intended, learns the ropes. Yes, sir. Oh, wait, just one more question. One more question. You threw him off before, so he gets a freebie. Thank you. On automation on board sailing vessels, you know, automation anywhere is fantastic when properly applied, right? If we understand how the automation works and the failure points, then we can look towards those as where our strengths and weaknesses are. They can not necessarily reduce manning, but reduce the workload on those on board. I think automation is a great thing when properly applied.